In today's episode of Children of Heroes, we visited Bucks on the northwest outskirts of London, where we interviewed Mr. Jan Paul Masat, son of Flight Sergeant Jan Josef Mašát.
Thank you for participating in our project Children of Heroes. Your father served with the Royal Air Force during the Second World War. Could you tell us how he got to England in the first place?
He trained as a pilot with the Czech Air Force, and then when the Germans invaded, he must have taken the decision to leave with other people, and I think they found out there was an opportunity to go to Poland, and I've only recently found out that he actually got away on a coal train. There's a picture of him on a ship leaving Poland heading for France, and he must have injured himself because he's got a bandage on his head and he's got his arm in a sling. That's when he left, and he was 21 at the time, which I often reflect on. I did wonder whether that might be the first time he'd been to the sea as well. So he's going from Poland to France, and that's how it started. He headed off to France.
From France, he came to England.
After some adventures, he, like other people, he had to join the Foreign Legion. So he went to Algeria, to a place called Sidi Bel Abbes, and I've got his Foreign Legion tags, the wrist band that he wore when he was there. And then on the other side you have his name, but spelt with a French Jean and a Z for Masat. He then came back from Algeria to France, and he has a certificate for flying with the French Air Force. So he flew with the French Air Force, and then ultimately he left France and came to Plymouth, and was then, I think his first stop was Cosford, RAF Cosford, which I think was the Czech depot where all the new people arrived. Yeah. And that's where he started in the RAF.
In England he flew as a fighter pilot.
He did initially, yes.
Actually had 2 crash landings, is that right?
Yes, that's what he told us. So he flew with 310 Squadron in Duxford. He came to the country in 1940, but he wasn't flying during the Battle of Britain. He was probably still going through his sort of training and building up ready to fly. I know he was hospitalised, but it didn't appear too serious, but he had actually incurred an injury to his neck, and later in life he had a problem with his neck that he had to have a brace. He had those crashes, and then after that I think his role changed to become an instructor.
Because of his injuries?
I think so.
He couldn't fly anymore.
Because he never kept a diary and he didn't write things down, we've only got anecdotes and the records that we can see. So I've had his records reviewed by the RAF Historical Society or Historical Group, and they've been able to tell me all the little details, because it's all written in very fine little abbreviations, and unless someone explains it you can't really work out what was happening. But he then had an opportunity, or he was sent to Canada, was learning how to use Link Trainer, which were the first of these became simulators where they were teaching pilots to fly on instruments, so they could fly in cloud and in the dark, which prior to that I think it was mostly daylight flying, and if you were in fog or cloud it was going to be very difficult. And he learnt how to do that in Canada, and then when he came back to the UK he was a Link Trainer instructor.
And he stayed in the UK, or he was sent abroad later?
No, after he came back from Canada he was in the UK, but moving around. Again, from his records he moved quite a lot, and at one time he was in Scotland on the Orkney Islands off the top of Scotland.
Where did he marry your mother?
This was after he'd got back. It was after the war, and after he'd been to Czechoslovakia. He went back in 1945, so I suppose welcomed home, and you know the history from there, that in 1948, like many others, he was taken into custody and sentenced. But in the time between 45 and 48 he had actually married and had a daughter. So whilst he was interred, an opportunity arose for him to escape, and he actually shared a cell with a German man. He told us it was a German, ironically so near to the war, And the German said he'd found a way to get out, but he needed someone to do it with him. So the two of them managed to escape. And then as soon as they were out, they kind of went their separate ways. They weren't friends, you can imagine. And he then did what you've heard other people do, which was effectively hide during the day and travel at night. So he was really making his way towards Germany and getting whatever food you could find in the forest or from people's gardens. And he then ended up in Germany in a displaced persons camp. And we've got his documents that he was given there. And he really looks quite slim, much slimmer than I remember him. I think he must have lost quite a bit of weight. But he was given a document that would allow him to travel. These were the documents that we've got in his records, which were, as far as I can tell, issued in Hamburg in 1949. And it's a United Nations document. He was actually interviewed by the Americans and the British, and different opportunities given to him. I don't know whether the Americans wanted him to work for them, maybe, but to come back to the UK, he had friends here, and there were some nice people that were looked after him during the wartime who became lifelong friends, and so I think his decision was to come back to the UK. He then rejoined the RAF, but at that stage they didn't need pilots, so he started at the bottom of the ladder. As an airman, and started to retrain again. He did some link trainer instruction, but he started to train as an air traffic controller. And it's during that period in the early 1950s when he met my mother. But as I said before, he was married and he couldn't go back, and ultimately that led to him being divorced. And it's a sad part of his life, but he supported his daughter financially whilst not being able to see her, and he had cards and different things sent from Czechoslovakia. And eventually he was able to marry my mother. And I've got documents of when he was learning to fly, so I know exactly how many hours he had when he was flying. And so it was over a reasonable amount of time, but I think it adds up to about 70 hours, which when you think of a 40-hour week of work, it's not that long to then be put into a Spitfire or a Hurricane. I always think it's like giving a trainee driver a Formula One car and saying, okay, now you're going to use this instead. So it must have been pretty challenging. This was his flying logbook, all filled in by hand. So yeah. Every flight is logged and handwritten. So flight number 1. It gives the time of each flight, so typically sort of 20 minutes at the start.
Altogether, 71 hours.
Yes. It's a lot of short flight, but doesn't add up to that much. His medals are Czech and British. I can get these out. Yeah, these are the Czech medals. I don't know if this is a military cross. And the British medals. He loved flying. I mean, he would talk about flying, and we used to go to air shows together, and he would love to see the Spitfires and Hurricanes and hear the noise of the engines. So he really did enjoy flying, but after that accident he didn't fly when he came back. So from the 50s onwards, he started then, his career started to move into air traffic control. So that's what he did through the 1950s, building up his skills and taking exams to be in charge of the aircraft taking off and landing. So he rejoined the RAF, got into air traffic control, and was moved around the country by the RAF quite a bit. There was an opportunity to go to Aden, or an opportunity, he was asked to go, or told to go to Aden, and he went out to RAF Kormaksa and did air traffic control there. And my mother had an opportunity, because she was a nurse, to go and work in the hospital next to the RAF base. So she followed him out.
They were together.
They were together in Aden, and they got married in Aden. So in 1960 they got married in Aden, and then later, as they wanted children, there was an opportunity to come back, and my mother came back in, and my sister was born in 1961, and then a year later I was born in 1962, and we were back in the UK again, moving. So we were up in Lincolnshire, a place called RAF Binbrook, and then we went to Norfolk. And so my sister and I, as toddlers, were in Norfolk, quite near a beach, So we have really good memories of growing up there. And then we moved to a place called Iverheath, which is where my mother still lives. She still lives in the same house. And it was really so that we could go into a mainstream school. And then my father moved a couple of times whilst we were there. So he actually worked away. He was in Lynham, which is another RAF place. And then in Northern Ireland, an RAF base there called Ballykelly. He was moving around, but with a view to him coming to the end of his time in the Air Force at 55. So at 55 it was planned to come out of the Air Force. And he actually went to the Central Air Traffic Control Centre, which is called London Air Traffic Control Centre. The people that work there called it LATC. So it's LATCC, it was always known as LATC. And part of it was military and the other part was civilian. Then he had an opportunity to transfer to do civilian air traffic control. And he really just went from one end of the building to the other. But he still had to go through interviews, so it was probably the first time for a long time he'd been interviewed for a job. And he was 55, but he was accepted for the job because he'd got good experience that was transferable from RAF. He seemed to make a lot of friends. A lot of people remember him, and there's a few websites, there's some various former pilots and air traffic controllers, and I come across messages about my dad and the stories he had to tell. But even those say that he didn't talk too much about the wartime, that it wasn't something he wanted to talk about, but probably talking about being Czech and his background interested people. And I have replied to some of those messages, and they were saying, oh, does anybody remember Jan Masat? And I kind of came across this and I wrote and said, well, he was my dad. So I was able to give them a bit of a summary of his life, what he'd actually done and what he'd been through. So it was nice to do that.
You yourself, you considered becoming a pilot, but in the end to choose civil engineering.
Yes.
What was the reason?
I don't think I wanted to join the RAF. I didn't want to be in the services, and civilian flying was very difficult to become a commercial pilot. It was a lot of training and a lot of money, so that wasn't very realistic. There were one or two family friends who worked in construction, and one of those particularly, I think, influenced me. I liked working outside as well, so the opportunity to be outside on construction projects was of interest. And yes, so I went off to do a degree in civil engineering, and yes, that's been my career. So I've been a civil engineer and done all sorts of things, and yeah, enjoyed it. I'm now a fellow of the Institution of Civil Engineers.
You are currently working on a very important railway project in London. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yes, it's the largest station to be built in the UK for 150 years, and it will be the high-speed terminus when it starts. So it'll run from London to Birmingham, but it also connects with the existing railway line, and so we have 6 underground high-speed lines and 8 overground platforms. So
and what's your role?
My role now is innovation manager. So I've been on the project for over 4 years. I started as a quality manager and had an opportunity to change. So now I'm innovation manager, looking at all sorts of things from robotics to new materials and all sorts in between. So it's a very interesting project to work on.
What was the most difficult part of this project?
I think there's a lot of documentation. There's a lot to do on the project, and a lot of coordination of all the different people and all the different companies that work here. So we have over 1,000 people on the site at any time, and as you see from our office building, we are a big team, and there's a lot to coordinate, but it's going well. I feel like I've achieved things in my career that, say, my dad died relatively young, so he didn't really see that. But yeah, I'm proud of what I've done, and I'm proud of what he achieved as well. I don't have major hobbies. I like to cycle, so I like to ride. I used to run when I was younger, so I'd run the London Marathon. Other hobbies, a bit of gardening. My dad, he liked gardening. He also liked cooking, so whatever he grew, he cooked, and he had a real interest in cooking. In fact, one of his friends, who was his squadron leader, ended up with a hotel, and Dad used to go and help him and, well, see his friend, but he'd always end up in the kitchen because he liked cooking so much. I think that was his real interest, not so much flowers, but vegetables.
Has your father's Czech background had a big influence on your life?
I think, I was thinking about this, in the early days, it didn't, because pre the internet, there wasn't much that we knew about Czechoslovakia. We had some books at home and they were mostly black and white and quite dark pictures of Prague, and I think we had one of Pilsen as well. So we didn't know too much about it, and I didn't really feel, because we couldn't travel there and we didn't have many relatives, I didn't really feel a connection. And it was only later, as things have changed, where I've been able to travel and my friends have travelled, and my friends all love going to Prague and they like the food and they really like the place, that I feel more connected. And I've started to research things with my father and getting the opportunity to come to the embassy and see events there. You know, the opportunity to drink Czech beer in the embassy is something my dad would never have foreseen. So the way things have changed and the way we can travel to this country, I feel much closer. And I would have said in the past, I probably wouldn't have said that I was Czech, because I didn't feel that connection, and I do feel it now. So I'm proud to tell people that I'm Czech.